This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On September the 12th, our Defense and Security Studies program began its Fall 2017 season with a presentation by retired Toronto Police Inspector James Brown, the Executive Director of the Global Resource Epicentre against Human Trafficking, who addressed the gathering on the impact of modern slavery.
Very kind. Thank you. So I really need to do, I've learned this term, by the way, of one of the conferences, a shout out. And I had no idea what that was because I always thought it was the guy up at the front yelling at the person at the back to close the door. But apparently a shout out, you do it on social media when you say something nice about somebody. So Kim Derry is my former boss. He's the retired deputy of Toronto. Much of this stems from his initiative. He happened to be president of the FBI's National Academy. The FBI National Academy is 18,000 law enforcement executives around the world. And in 2010, he happened to be the president of that, traveled around the world, and found that the single largest pressing point for police leaders globally was human trafficking. With that, he undertook the initiative to start a process of conferences, and since he couldn't rope anybody else into looking after it, he asked me. From that, we ended up doing an extensive consultation globally to set up our charity. And now I'm the executive director, and he's the chair of the board. So he's still my boss. So Kim, thank you very much. Great leadership in this space, by the way. So human trafficking, it's getting a lot more notoriety, a lot more scope, a lot more coverage as time goes by. And I'm see if I can make this advance properly. Yes. We've got human trafficking days now. We've got human trafficking NGOs. There are lots of them. Lots of people working in this space. Lot of coverage for it. We've got movies about it. Hollywood is covering it. It's on TV now. So lots of people are now hearing about human trafficking. Unfortunately, almost nobody knows what it is, but everybody has heard of it. So this evening, we're going to delve a little bit more into trying to scrape away at the surface to understand what human trafficking is. And I hope that at the end of this, you'll have a better idea about the scope of it, the impact, what we're doing about it, what can be done, and where everybody's going with it. Fortunately, this is a really small crowd. I think I know actually everybody personally here. So please, at any point in this, don't hesitate at all to put your hand up and either ask a question or cite me for being really wrong because I've gone offside with something. A couple of things that human trafficking, we do want to clarify at the very beginning. Human trafficking, most people assume to be the international movement of people. Now, the human trafficking started with the trafficking legislation in the US by a guy down there called Chris Smith, a congressman, who drafted it. When I helped them put it together in 2004, I happened to be working in Washington. Chris happened to be the congressman for a friend of mine. I was consulted on the drafting of the draft legislation. I had no idea where this was going to go to. So I can actually say, yes, I was there at the very beginning of this. That legislation eventually led to the creation of some UN legislation or a General Assembly resolution, which was signed in Palermo, Italy. Consequently, it's called the Palermo Protocol. And that is what gives us a definition today about human trafficking. We're going to go into that in a moment. But most people think, okay, UN, human trafficking, therefore it's international trafficking movement, so people have got to be moved around. And that's not actually true. People have got to be exploited. Human trafficking is exploitation, pure and simple. It is exploitation for labor. Now that labor comes in a whole raft of different forms. The two principal ones are exploitation of manual labor and sexual exploitation are the two that are most common. But these are all forms of labor. And it is people that are getting, being exploited for their labor purposes. And we'll get into how that actually happens. but it's secured through violence, through intimidation, through deception, fraud. But trafficking is not smuggling. So anybody here heard of human smuggling? Yes? Okay. Pretty common, and frequently we will see politicians, news media, etc., talking about human trafficking, human smuggling, irregular immigration, a whole slew of other things. That's like saying I have milk, apple juice, coffee, but they are the same thing. They are radically different. So, human trafficking versus human smuggling. This piece comes from the US State Department. So, trafficking is exploitation. People being, their labor and services are being exploited. It's through fraud, it's through deception. They are victims. They've been enslaved. This is modern day slavery. It does not involve the movement of people, transnational or cross borders, but it does require that they be exploited. Human smuggling, on the other hand, the person being smuggled is complicit in the crime. They know that they're doing something wrong, and they're paying money to actually be moved transnationally. It requires them to be moved over a border. It does not require them to be exploited. It does not require them to have any engagement with the smugglers afterwards. So I'm put into the back of a truck, I'm taken across the border, I get out of the truck, I've paid my $15,000, and I go on my way. I have been smuggled. I have not been trafficked. Now, where we get some bleed over is traffickers will say to somebody, I'm going to smuggle you into the new country. You can have a wonderful life. You're going to have a great job. You're going to get paid lots of money. But don't worry about paying me. It's okay. I'll do it for free, and you can pay me back when we're done. Then they get across the border, and that payment never ends. Then they are being trafficked. So they start with smuggling, and they move into trafficking. But trafficking and smuggling are different things on the onset. So just wanted to go over about what the difference is between the two. So the international definition that's accepted by most countries now, and I think 144 countries are signatories to this, this is the definition of trafficking from the United Nations. So in there, it requires the use of force, coercion, abuse of power for people to be exploited. It includes for sexual exploitation, labor exploitation, slavery practices, and it includes the removal of organs. Now, I think we were estimating that IS was doing like $1 million a week or something in a day in removal of organs from people captured behind IS lines during the height of the caliphate when they were looking for resources for money. There had been instances in South America, kids at orphanages that hadn't been identified by the time they were 10, 11, 12, 13. Someone would go in and say, oh, that's my cousin's third son, twice removed. Take the kid out, harvest the organs, and dispose of the body. So that kind of harvesting of organs, which is obviously murder, but they're doing it for trafficking purposes, falls within the scope of human trafficking. So in Canada, in 2012, now we had designed a lot of legislation throughout the post-2000. But it really came to a head in 2012 with the completion of human trafficking integration into the criminal code. Now, you'll probably notice in this case, we do identify what the purpose of it is, or the process. If you recruit, transport, transfer, receive, hold, all of those things, and you do it for exploitation. The person doesn't say that the person has to have been defrauded, deceived, use of force or anything. It is just if you exploit a person for those purposes, you have committed slavery or human trafficking in Canada. So the Criminal Code Section 279 has been modified now to address these issues. So the RCMP and the OPP now, as well as the Toronto Police Service, have dedicated human trafficking investigators that are looking into this. That brings us to a whole nother slew of questions that we're going to address in a moment. So how do you victimize somebody and get them to become your slave, to do things for you? So in a lot of countries, that can be abuse of power. People can do it from a power position. You can intimidate them. You can threaten them. You can deceive them. There's all manner of ways you can do it. I happen to have just undertaken some research in Toronto, taking a look at all the human trafficking instances in Toronto in 2014 and 2015. So there were a number of things that were interesting in Toronto. One is that there were no transnational victims. First of all, every victim in Toronto that Toronto police had investigated was born in Toronto, born in Canada. So there were no language barriers and there were no cultural barriers. And we'll get into those are critical points for human trafficking. You don't have to have them, but they are very common and internationally recognized. 66% of the victims were all registered high school students. All of them were sexual trafficking victims. There were no labor trafficking victims outside those being sexually assaulted. And all of them, 66% of those, so same number as high school students, had been contacted via social media by a friend to be induced into this. So those threats include, so these are remember, these are our kids in Toronto. Girls going to high school and McDonald and Emory and Lakeshore. So the deception methodology is they're brought in, they meet a guy, a friend knows a guy, going to introduce them, way of making money. So the use of force included things like putting a 9mm in the girl's mouth. I'm going to cap you if you don't do this. Pulling the gun out, I'm going to kill your parents if you don't do this. Hey, remember, these are 16-year-old girls. So a guy pulls out a 9mm pistol, sticks it at your head and says, I'm going to kill your parents if you don't do as I say. You're probably going to get a high level of cooperation from them. But then when we talk about human trafficking, this isn't something, I'm not talking about Bangladesh or Myanmar, I'm talking about downtown Toronto. So it is a global problem with global consequences and global victims. So how do you keep these people enslaved after you've done that? You've stuck a gun in their head or you've stuck a gun in their mouth. Most people have this vision of human trafficking victims as being locked in a room, handcuffed to a bed, changed up. That's not where the enslavement comes here. You only have to be convinced that you are enslaved. You only have to be convinced that the person is going to undertake the threat that they've made to you. So if it's your parents, you only have to be convinced that the bad guy is going to kill them in the middle of the night while they're sleeping and you're never going to see them again. You only have to be convinced that he's going to chop off your right leg. Now, in many instances we've seen in third world countries, that was in 5, 10, 15, 20 victims. Someone's run away, they're brought back and beaten to death in front of everybody else. So that's, you just need to believe that you're next in order for you to be enslaved. And after you've broken a person's will like that, they will continue to do what it is that you want them to. Now, the rough estimates for sex slavery income give you some frame of reference about why this is so lucrative. A single female that is being trafficked can generate about $250,000 a year in cash, non-taxable cash profits. So if an individual is running a stable of 4 women, that's $1 million cash. Nobody looks twice at you when you walk down the street with them. They don't look like a trafficking victim because we have no idea what that looks like. You're taking cash in from people. Nobody recognizes it. And this is much better than drugs because it's a never-ending revenue stream from your trafficking victim. It's easier and faster and better than guns because there's all manner of problems surrounding that. So human trafficking is becoming the new emerging economy for transnational organized crime, which is one of the things that why the UN had identified this in 2010 under their transnational organized crime protocol. So just going to talk about a couple of things for human trafficking victims and where they are used. Like, why are we're talking about sexual exploitation, but is that the end of it? It's not. International statistics suggest that about 60% of victims are used in labor exploitation, not sexual exploitation. So it's about 60-40 is what's now agreed to as a balance for it. So those people are on doing things like fisheries. And I don't know whether anybody had seen the news reports. Tesco, Costco, and a few others had been purchasing shrimp from a cooperative in Thailand. The shrimp that came to the cooperative came from ships in which the seamen were being trafficked. So guys had been on those boats for years and not allowed off. And again, like in terms of use of force, somebody complains, I don't want to do this anymore. Of course, the captain brings him up to the front, puts a pistol in his head, blows his brains out, and the other people on the ship don't complain anymore. So fisheries, clothing industry, building material development in a lot of third world countries. It is brick building are frequently done by people that are being trafficked. And in agriculture, and that extends across North America for agriculture, a number of recoveries of victims of human trafficking in Florida in citrus groves. Labor inspectors in Florida going to a citrus site where they're harvesting fruit and finding people actually corralled and chained up at night so that they can't escape by several dozen people. So they've had a lot of those issues in the U.S. On the services side, things like office cleaning, a large human trafficking ring broken up in Hamilton. They were Hungarians, had brought over human trafficking victims, and they were cleaning offices at night. As you can imagine, at night, the cleaning staff don't see anybody. There's nobody around to ask questions of. There's nobody to see you. So it's a great use of that. And of course, if you're charging regular going rates and not paying out on labor, it can be very lucrative. Domestic service, the United Arab Emirates had an ongoing challenge with this by their own admission and are working hard on trying to counter it. Domestic servitude in the UAE. We see it in restaurants, nail and massage spas. I was working with the Department of Homeland Security in Baltimore over identification of people there using Asian women to come in, provide nail services that were being trafficked, and obviously as well as sex services. So some of these ones, these are legitimate industries like Costco and that were buying fishery products. These are legitimate industries in which human trafficking is appearing in the supply chain. Now, for companies that are buying these things in goodwill, I'm buying from a supplier, and the supplier's buying from a producer. And somewhere along that line, somebody knows that this isn't right. Because we've moved from the supplier all the way down to the trafficker. And somewhere people know this is kind of hinky. I'm getting too good a deal, or I'm getting a kickback, something like that. But as we move further and further up the supply chain, now it gets to the corporate head offices in North America who have no idea. And of course, this story breaks, as it did with The Guardian, and Tesco shares take a nosedive because after about 24 hours after it breaks, it's all over social media, and the corporation's trying to pick up the pieces of what happened. So human trafficking in the supply chain is a real challenge. B, the United States is on the brink of introducing federal legislation to it. California already has a piece of legislation, Transparency in the Supply Chain Act, that is very encompassing. So we're seeing more of this work emerging in legislative work emerging across countries. So this is a huge risk for corporations, and a lot of companies are now turning to both their suppliers and consulting firms to try and help them manage this piece of work. Now, those were all legitimate companies, but of course, human trafficking is illegal, so we have the criminal sector that is also making money on this. So trafficking victims are being used in the production and international movement of drugs. They're being used in the production and international movement of weapons, counterfeit goods, illegal mining, and illegal deforestation, sexual services, money laundering, fraud. We've got a number of instances in the GTA and across southern Ontario. The Victim is used as a straw man. She's brought in with her trafficker and sat down, and she then applies for credit cards, line of credit, in some fraudulent name. Then move to another site. So the card's maxed out, loans not paid back, but that's all part of the fraud part. So you can imagine the human trafficking piece is criminals, but it's only one part of criminal enterprise. So there's people that are involved in fraudulent documentation that are involved, people that are involved in the movement, people that are involved in the harboring, and their victims are used for a variety of different purposes. In money laundering, transnational movement of everything from gems to cash and convertibles, victims are used for those purposes as well. And obviously drug trafficking, the movement of drugs and movement of weapons. So how big is the problem? Everybody's heard about it, and you've seen it on TV, and there's movies about it. So surely to goodness we should have some idea about how big it is. So I've got statistics that say it's a few 100,000 people globally to statistics that say it's over 200 million. This morning, the Global Slavery Index rated at 48.5 million, give you an idea of where their numbers are. And nobody has any idea. There are not good statistics on it, and that is because the crime is, by its very nature, is underground and unviewable. You don't see it. You have no idea whether the guy walking down the street, if we looked out onto University, and a guy's walking down there with a girl, is she a trafficking victim or not? Because there is no difference from the outside observer. So trying to gather the statistics on this has posed a huge challenge and continues to be a barrier to trying to define it and determine how large it is. That, of course, has an impact upon how much time, effort, and money governments give to it and government agencies, because we don't know how big it is. One of the unique aspects of human trafficking is human trafficking victims see themselves as offenders. Now, what happens is the trafficker has convinced them that they are part of the crime. If they're being moved transnationally, he's convinced them that your transnational movement is illegal. If you're found out, the authorities are going to arrest you and deport you. If you're participating in the fraud, they provide some of the fraud. So it's $100,000 fraud. $100 is given to the victim. Now you're part of the scam. So you've benefited from this. So you're going to jail. If we get caught, you're an offender. So when police are investigating this, you're not talking about somebody who's putting their hand up going, I've been trafficked and I'm a victim. You're talking to somebody who's going, I don't know what you're talking about, and I don't want to talk to you at all. And he said I shouldn't talk to you, so I'm not going to. So that makes it hugely difficult for police engagement and even for NGOs, because your victim is not saying, I'm a victim and I need help. They're saying exactly the opposite. I'm involved in this, whether I want to be or not, I'm involved in this. So just leave me alone. So that is the distinct difference between every other crime where the victim puts up their hand and goes, I need some sort of assistance, and human trafficking where the victim goes, not me. I'm not actually a victim. I know I'm an offender. I don't want to be part of this. That makes it very difficult from a policing standpoint, because your victims are the ones that are also going, I have gone on to commit these offenses, and they act like offenders.
If they were charged, would they be convicted?
Depends on a whole slew of issues, but someone who commits a crime under duress, that it's a defense for any criminal offense. So depends upon how much information they're bringing, how much information the police are bringing to it, what the Crown Attorney's view on it is, a whole series of things. Lack of information, lack of awareness by both policing, Crown Attorneys, judges, continues to pose a significant challenge in this area. Because if you don't know what you're looking for and don't understand it, then it simply looks like your trafficking victim is a fraudster and is going to get arrested for it. No.
Do they tend to be represented by the same counsel?
No. They've they ought not to be, but if it's not understood that they are a trafficking victim, then the trafficker and the trafficking victim can end up in the same, not the same interview room, but certainly with the same counsel, and the trafficker can end up continuing to manipulate the trafficked victim, who, of course, at this point, sees the trafficker as someone doing them a favor, not somebody that's exploiting them. Sir.
Can you comment upon large-scale national involvement of certain countries like People's Republic of China and their labor contract companies, which are responsible, so is my understanding, for most of the infrastructure of airports and roads in Africa, where the number of people in the contracting company are amounts of tens of thousands, and they're locked in by a wire fence at night. Why are we not thinking about that as being exploitation on a national basis when the People's Republic of China does it all the time? The second thing I want to ask you that's connected to this is whether or not you're aware, because I've been trying to find out, and I have found out very little about it, which harkens back rather bridge to your earlier comment on deforestation in British Columbia of several thousands of acres of forest being now exploited by Chinese PRC, I mean in that respect, or rather Southeast Asian forestation companies in the province of British Columbia, which is the acreage is up to or may exceed 100,000 acres or hectares, whatever. Do you know anything about that?
So
what's your comment about the national involvement?
So my short answer would be no, I don't. In terms of national level exploitation, there have been some investigator reported instances, and I don't know whether they turned into investigations. Workers that came over from China through national placement agencies of the Chinese government that are working in Canada, where the coordinators, who are employees of the government of China, are the handlers. So we've had people that have escaped from those circumstances and then reported them to the police. Where the investigations led to after that, I don't know. But yes, do governments participate in this, given that abuse of authority is a key component to human trafficking? Not just China, but anywhere that you would find dictatorship and closed governments, you're likely to find trafficking. So, Eric.
Do you find instances where, harking back to what you were saying about the trafficker and his victim both having the same counsel, do you find there are occasions when the counsel was in fact implicit?
I haven't personally, and I haven't seen any investigations that revealed that. That doesn't mean that that's not the case. It just means that, no, I don't personally know about it. So, okay, I've about 2/3 of the way through this, so hopefully we'll be able to wrap things up. Some of the impacts for human trafficking. The clear one, I think, is the moral implication. Most people would find human trafficking abhorrent. The abuse that goes on, as well as the crimes that are associated with it. By that I mean assault and murder, rape and abuse. But there is on the labor side, there is an economic imbalance with slave labor. Every economic model requires that when you provide a service or a good, that there is a cost for labor, a cost for infrastructure. It's how we do calculations for costing and analysis. What happens is, in human trafficking, that labor has no cost. You can't have an economic model in which labor has no cost because it's inherently unfair. So when you use the funds from trafficking for corruption and reduced labor costs, it can throw your economy out of balance. And if you're an emerging democracy, the corruption and human trafficking can not only throw the economy out of balance, but it can throw your country into turmoil. So we may not see that in Canada. Here it is a crime in which we're concerned about the victims. But for many countries, this is a crime that can lead to both a social and economic imbalance and ultimately to do destabilization, which is why one of the reasons the UN is so concerned about it, because it can destabilize emerging democracies. There's also the illegal and untaxed revenue that it produces, violence and intimidation for the victims. And in our case, including Canada, there's an impact on community, social services, health. Study from Minnesota showed that just on the sex trafficking amongst juveniles, so this is girls under 18 being trafficked in Minnesota, the cost ratio of enforcement to proactive work was about $34 to 1. So they calculated, and that was just on the justice sector. So for treating them from a health perspective and dealing with them in justice perspective, for every dollar that they had spent, it would cost $34 to deal with them afterwards, as opposed to $1 in prevention. So the prevention versus cure piece is pretty obvious. Personal versus corporate impacts. Corporations are vulnerable to this in the supply chain. The repercussions, of course, can be everything from boycotts to fines levied by governments where legislation's in place, to litigation. A young girl just outside Washington was trafficked at a hotel near Baltimore. And when she escaped, she went back and sued the hotel for $100 million, I think. Which of course they couldn't pay, but that meant that she seized the hotel and all their assets and everything else. So you could be subjected to litigation as well. And then in the States, California has the Transparency in the Supply Chains Act, and the US is working towards federal legislation. So what are we doing about it? Public awareness. This is all part of that public awareness campaign, so thanks very much for your efforts this evening. Most countries have criminalized some elements of human trafficking. Canada's, as you saw, was one of the examples. We now have emerging supply chain legislation. Police services like Toronto have put together human trafficking units. The OPP, the province of Ontario, has a coordinator for human trafficking. So more and more jurisdictions are working towards enforcement, and there's a very strong support network of NGOs. So are we doing enough, and can we do any more? Human trafficking is a whole of, well, instead of a whole of government, a whole of community response. It doesn't require just government. It doesn't require it's not an enforcement issue. It's not a judicial issue. It is a whole of community issue. It requires everybody to be involved. So that's not just public health and healthcare and community services and education, law enforcement, judiciary, but it also includes NGOs, community groups, faith leaders. The entire community has got to create an awareness of it and work towards a solution. NGO and governments have got to work together better. After 33 years of policing, I can tell you that that's not something on the police side that we're necessarily particularly good at, but it was always an aspirational goal. We're trying to work better. Police organizations need to work in greater collaboration with NGOs towards solving the problem. We need greater training and awareness in all sectors, Crown attorneys, the judiciary, correctional services, as well as policing, and NGOs, educators, public health. It spans the entire gambit. And there needs to be greater official, organizational, and agency cooperation. NGOs for data sharing, MOUs for data sharing between different agencies. That's one of the challenges I'm facing now in my line of work, and that's something that is posing a considerable challenge. So,
sorry, what is MOU?
my apologies, a memorandum of understanding. Yeah, where we both write something down and agree to it. So, I apologize. It's one of those police speak things. You get into that groove. Yes, ma'am.
The victims of human trafficking, whether it's sexual or labor, are they recoverable?
So are victims recoverable? You can see I'm pausing on this one because it's a tough response. The FBI estimated that a victim would be re-victimized 7 times before they would be able to mentally escape human trafficking.
When you say re-victimize.
So they're being trafficked and they're rescued during an operation, and they're taken out of that environment and they're provided counseling. And they slide back into it and they are re-victimized again by another trafficker. And they leave and they recover and they slide back into it, and 7 times is the average.
So is that because they were caught when they were young and they don't believe they had any alternative?
No, it's lack of support on trying to get people out. Reintegrated into the community, providing meaningful work and engagement, as well as counseling. So, thanks for this, because it does open the opportunity. Human trafficking is brainwashing, for lack of a better term. We actually have to take somebody and convince them that they are a slave and that they cannot leave. So you have to convince them that what they're doing is right and that you're right and that there is no alternative for them. And you have to break their spirit. You have to make sure that they are totally compliant to your will.
Does that include addiction?
It could, and not always, but sometimes. And addiction may be part of it, or it may be a component of the process to break their will. Yes, so I was going to say, why is it different? So one is the victim, as I mentioned before, doesn't report the crime because they see themselves as a perpetrator. The victim fears the consequences because and bear in mind, all I need to do is convince you that I have the ability to do something. So you're over here in Toronto with me, and your parents are in Myanmar, Thailand, Panama. I only have to convince you that I can have the capacity to kill them tonight if you don't do as you're told. So that's really what it boils down to. I've got to be able to convince you, to deceive you, to coerce you into doing what I'm commanding you to do, and you have to believe that I have the capacity to do it.
Is there a typical way the police become aware of an offense, or in terms of how it's reported to the police?
Interestingly, all the ones I took a look at that were all identified as human trafficking offenses by the investigating officers were all reported by the victims, which is incredibly inconsistent with international philosophy on this. Normally it is through drug trafficking or prostitution, and they identify places in which people are involved in this. They then arrest everybody and then try to identify if anybody is being trafficked and who it is that's victimized. Other than that, NGOs come forward and say, this is the location in which we know that people are being trafficked. Yeah.
Why do you think people slip back into the same thing? You say generally the rate is 7 times they will go back.
Right.
I find that unusual because you're saving them from a situation that they didn't want to be in, that they were desensitized.
Yep.
So why, after taking them back and getting them out of that situation, would they go back into it?
Not to be disrespectful, but I will give you a scenario for this that you have no frame of reference for. You've never undergone my guess is, you've never undergone the kind of physical and mental abuse that they have to be able to understand what that psychological pain and despair, what that would feel like. And that's what it is the trafficker has broken their will, and they are they are more susceptible to being compliant. We do not do a good job on rebuilding that resilience. And that's where, in my estimation, one of our big failings is. Trying to rebuild that is a very difficult, long, arduous. This is like de-radicalizing jihadists. One of those other issues that we're facing is how do you take somebody and reverse the mental process that they've been through? Very difficult.
Just on the policing side that I can speak to, the few cases that I have been involved with, generally they come over like a domestic call, a domestic incident or a boyfriend. My boyfriend, because a lot of the time the victims sort of perceive, because of the grooming process, the offender as their boyfriend or whatever, and that's sort of how the initial investigation
Starts with that.
gets involved. they know it's wrong or it's their comfortable level. Like they've been doing this for so long, they try something and they're not comfortable and they kind of fall back into.
And that, to your point, it is a condition to be comfortable in that environment. No,
It's similar to the abused wife that, runs away to the shelter and flees and later goes back to the husband and goes on and on for a considerable period of time until she gets the support of the lesser of the
same idea in terms of the mental abuse that goes on in order to condition a victim.
If they feel that's what you deserve, and
That's-
that you can't go home again to your family because of what's happened. You can't go back to your school, your friends.
Yeah. And this, a lot of this is, you can't return to your normal environment because of what you've experienced. Yeah.
My
Oh,
last
sorry.
question. With reference to the janitorial service or office cleaning or condominium cleaning, whatever you want to call it, in that particular area, most of that seems to be done by Central Americans in Toronto. Has there ever been a case uncovered that these people who barely speak English, who work very hard, are victims because their services are so inexpensive that they're hard? The second part of that question is the contracting party who hires such services knowingly or unknowingly complicit to the crime?
So in answer to the first part, one of the arrests was in Hamilton, where it was a office cleaning group, and they were Hungarians that were being brought in. So yes, there have been prosecutions in that space. The second part, if you hired a contractor in good faith and they are using trafficking victims, you're not complicit in it. That being said, if you take a look at this going, that's really too good to be true. I can't believe I'm getting them for $6 an hour. Wow, that's pretty good. And you ought to have known. Could there be some consequence to that? Probably not criminal, but there might be civil consequence to it.
Would you be surprised that this is going on within the Greater Toronto area right now?
Would I be? No, I would be surprised if it's not.
It's not going on.
Right. So what my area, I will digress slightly, my area of expertise and work is to take a look at organizational structure in policing to see how they adapt to human trafficking investigations. As it happens, Toronto's human trafficking unit is situated within their sexual assault squad. So I shouldn't be surprised when all the crimes that they investigate are sexual assaults. Peel Regionals is within their organized crime unit. Durham as a standalone unit. York is within their gang unit. So I happen to be working with the Deputy Minister of Community Safety and Correctional Services, trying to undertake research in that space to find out whether or not we should structure how human trafficking investigative units are structured and their placement for that very reason. So Toronto didn't find any because I think they're not structured to find any. So. Eric.
I'm not sure I'm keeping you from reaching a conclusion, but I'm extremely interested in your talk in the context of the Toronto Star's article on Saturday about the role of temporary agencies and the outward resemblance between what was going on and reported in that story and trafficking. But what most interests me about that whole story, and I don't know if you read it, is the culmination in which the counsel for the firm threatened the newspaper reporter herself with criminal prosecution, presumably unaware that they can't play charges in Canada.
For those that hadn't read the article, it's a pastry firm up in North York that makes pastries for Costco and Loblaws and a bunch of others. And they use temporary employees. And one of them had died last year, I think, as their hijab had gotten caught in the machinery and they'd been killed. So the Star was doing an investigative article into it. But the firm was, in that case, this was not a matter of supply chain human trafficking. This was where you were knowingly engaged in exploitation. Now, whether or not they have human trafficking victims that are working for them and they are knowingly engaged in that, I'm not going to speculate, but that was certainly what the article was alluding to, I think.
Yeah, I was most interested in the active threat against the reporter.
Yeah, and of course they can suggest that they'll go report it to the police, who would then take the role to prosecute. But no, of course you can't, unless you.
Can Great go out and, can you go out and actually investigate or get in or?
No.
But you can't.
No, we are, what we did after our consultations with quite a number of academics and NGOs and government agencies, including Department of Homeland Security, FBI, sheriff's offices, and as well as NGOs. We took a look at what the UN was committed to doing and what signatory countries, including Canada and the United States, had committed to under the General Assembly Act. Articles 5, 9, and 7 had committed, or 5, 9, and 10 had committed them to training, information sharing, and development of relationships, including with NGOs and civil society. So our goal and effort is intelligence development. It's one of the areas that is, by the industry's own admission, this is the piece that's missing. Nobody is supplying jurisdictions, cross jurisdictions transnationally, with intelligence on this, certainly not with NGOs. And we talked to NGOs about would things like victim profiling, the profiling of processes, those sorts of things help you. And of course, NGOs don't have an intelligence agency to be able to go to. And law enforcement is not particularly keen on sharing that. So GREAT's efforts are to do that, is to develop and disseminate intelligence, and to do resource coordination. There is no global standard for resources. And in fact, during the current migrant crisis, the EU has been providing considerable funds to agencies in Libya that turn out to be, they're trafficking firms, okay, but it's just they're actually trafficking in people, which is not what the EU wanted to actually pay for. So there's nobody that's actually coordinating on the resource side, which is what we're trying to do, as well as provide education support, as well as research. The people that are involved with us are global from around the world. Most of them are academics or law enforcement that have moved into academia. So we're trying to do a lot of research coordination with them in this space, as well as do intelligence development.
So there's a huge bureaucracy, but right down on the ground, what happens if I suspect somebody is being trafficked?
I would call the police.
Call the police.
Yes.
And am I complicit in any way by reporting a suspicion?
No, not at all. It's whether it's 222 tips or whether it's calling your local station or if it's an emergency calling 911. If you say a set of circumstances, this is where a number of people would take a look at this and go, that looks hinky, but I'm not sure really. I can't put my finger on it. That's okay. You can still call to say, I've got a suspicion of that this is a problem. Sometimes, Dan and I were just talking earlier, a person's house gets broken into and something gets stolen and they call the police because they lost something. My house gets broken into and nothing gets stolen. So which one are the police concerned about? Everybody figures the one where something went missing? Or, no, one where nothing went missing. The one where nothing went missing means that the person that broke in may well be a predator. That's the one that worries me, not the one where, so people would take a look at a set of circumstances and go, I'm not sure, I'm really, I don't know what I tell the police. Sometimes it's when you're reporting it saying, here's the set of circumstances that I saw. An investigator will look at that and go, bingo, that's exactly what we're looking for. So yes, it's up to everybody to participate in this and know what the signs are that you're looking for. And
No,
if-
is there any attempt made to actually, I know in some areas where I've been in public washrooms, when there have been signs up there saying, if you are a victim or being trafficked, contact so-and-so.
Yeah.
But that's only in very few, very limited areas. Is there any sort of global
initiative in that
initiative
regard?
in that area?
Yes, there is. There is a global initiative from the United States. The Polaris Project in the U.S. has attempted to provide a 1-800 number globally, as well as have their information translated into numerous languages in order to create that kind of awareness. So there are NGOs that are working in that capacity. The province of Ontario's human trafficking coordinator is relatively new, but she is working at that creating public awareness effort in Ontario too.
I can just add, Crime Stoppers just launched a campaign also, Crime Stoppers Journal. And if you go onto their website, they mock it up like a hotel where most of these human sex trafficking crimes occur.
But I'm just the victim. I'm out there on the street and and how do I know what to do or who to call if in fact I have the nerve to do it?
And that's now, as it turns out, all the ones that I reviewed in 14 and 15, all the victims went to the police and reported it.
But they
So-
can go to victim services.
Yep.
for that
Yep.
too, because sometimes they're not comfortable going to police, so.
That's right.
Victim
Depending on where they
services
come
is
from.
good.
So Great's role as a charitable Canadian, registered Canadian charity, is to try and provide that, bridge that gap for both NGOs and law enforcement, judiciary, and border security and intelligence services, is to work on the development of intelligence, dissemination of it, coordination of training and resources and research. So to that end, I'm very happy to announce that we just had our first practicum student from UOIT, a fourth-year social justice student, is now been assigned to us as of Thursday of last week. So I'm very happy about that. So we're trying to make some headway in that space.
Between you in Great and the provincial government, where there seems to be an absence of any legislation or investigation, but it takes two people to make this work in many industries. You have to have the enabler who will hire the person. That's the point I was trying to make before. Should there not be some legislation by way of some due diligence into that particular area provincially, if not federally, and cannot Great do something about that? Instead of working on a very high level with the United Nations, can you not work locally to prevent what is now going on in this city? Which is why I raised the point in my own building. I'm suspicious of it.
Okay.
But when I went to management, let me finish.
Yep, sorry.
When I went to management and told them about it, they thought I was wrong to even bring up such a thing with regard to the billionaires that own this building. So we need to fill the gap with local legislation. The enabling of these people to take advantage of the victims is the problem. They must be held responsible and held to account. And they must disprove, the same as the law of having an item which is in possession of stolen goods. They must disprove they do nothing. An analogy must be driven there, and that will disappear very quickly. You get rid of the enabler, you get rid of the problem.
The Supply Chain Transparency Act that they've brought about in California was designed to give teeth to that issue. That being said, there's no criminal penalty associated with it. It is monetary fines for corporations. But if you're a participant in this, and the federal legislation says anybody that is harboring or participating in this, and you know that the person is being exploited, you are criminally liable for it. So it would depend upon the nature of the depth of knowledge that could be proved from a court perspective as to whether or not.
knowingly or unknowingly.
So it would
This might
be,
the analogy to be possession of stolen goods, because that is the same situation. I can hide behind that shield that I did not know and take advantage of it. That shield must disappear.
okay. So any other questions? Nola?
Yes, you mentioned there were 144 signatories.
Yes.
That must leave about 40 or 50 not. Are the people who aren't signing on, the countries that aren't signing on to this, ones where you believe a significant number of the international slaves are coming from?
No.
Or
No, they are principally countries, and I think just about everybody, because it goes from signatory to enacting, and I think all the countries have agreed to it. It's not everybody is a signatory to it yet. So countries in which in which victims are coming from, no, are quite keen. Thailand, I think, is a commonly cited example, and Thailand has one of the strongest human trafficking legislations globally. So, Dana.
Jim, I had a 3 o'clock in the morning incident where a woman in a coffee shop in distress, and through a language assistant we figured out that she had run away from her matrimonial home where she'd been brought in from the Middle East. Her family had paid a dowry to the family that received her in Scarborough. She was received into the family and then put to work by the mother. Horrendous hours. Married to one of the sons, shared with the other sons. So fits the definition of human trafficking. And yet, because of the cultural ramifications, we were, let's say, on thin ice. You're careful, if you get my drift.
Yep.
So it's definitely human trafficking, in my humble opinion, and yet it goes on every day in Toronto. You bring in a bride, you put her to work forever.
Now, an interesting comment was provided by a human trafficking victim from Hungary, who Kim and I have worked with. And she was, hers was one of the more classic cases of human trafficking, a job in the press industry, media industry in Toronto. Flight ticket is provided, arrives at the airport, guy meets her at the airport, out to the parking lot, bag over her head, into a hotel room, beaten, raped 20, 30 times a day for 9 months until she finally escapes, gets back to Hungary. 10 years, 10, 15 years later, she finally gets that much counseling and time to pass before she finally realizes it wasn't her fault, and has come back to Canada, is now a big NGO advocate and works collaboratively. But she's when we're downtown, is quite fond of going, yeah, that's that apartment there, yeah, they were trafficked there, and that hotel down there, and the hotel down there. So she's talking about a lot of international trafficking victims, but when you get to people that are, where there's language barriers, cultural barriers, and see themselves as participants in the offense, this becomes a really tough crime to investigate and to prosecute.
Especially on the marital side.
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, one more question, and then, Jim, if you're amenable to taking more questions at the bar downstairs.
There's a good idea. There's a good idea. Upstairs, yes.
Any last questions for Jim before we?
Thank you very much for questions and comments.
This has been another in the series of podcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find notices of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives on our website at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the Institute, this is Eric Morse saying please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and thank you for listening.